Hello there, folks, and welcome back once again to another episode of Southbank Live, our weekly YouTube broadcast where we discuss some of the topics that are going on in investment markets and across the world at the minute. My name is Boaz Shoshan. I'm joined once again by John Butler. John, how are you getting on this evening?
Very well. It's a lovely, lovely spring evening out here in the countryside.
Yeah, it's been quite a nice spell of weather. It's even affected Aberdeen at the minute, which is very nice, very rare, I would say. Though maybe I just have something of a tainted memory for such things. Good evening to everybody who has tuned in, of course, to this as a live show. It's great to do this as a live show, and do feel free to leave any comments or questions that you have throughout the show just in the comments tab. Just to start us off this evening, John, we do have a very target-rich environment. There's any number of things that we could discuss for several hours on end, I'm sure. But just to start us off with, how about we go with our long-short segment to begin with, just to get things off to a light start.
Sure. And I'll revisit something here that I brought up before, so forgive me for that. But today's a big day in financial markets, but not necessarily in the way that people necessarily look at closely. It's a big reversal day in the foreign exchange market. We're seeing the dollar really weakening hard. And it's the biggest down move we've seen in the broad dollar index for, well, basically pretty much ever since the big period of dollar strength got started right around the time that the war in Ukraine was kicking off. And I did mention, I believe, last session that the yen was trading somewhat better and that the yen can be a leading indicator of things like this. And sure enough, now it's broad based. You're seeing the euro strengthen versus the dollar. You're even you're even seeing the pound strengthen versus the dollar, when of course the pound in theory has every reason to keep going down. And so I think that's quite significant. And it may be a one off, but because I've already kind of seen this pattern building and completing, the dollar's just too strong. It's way out of line with where it should be. The US has certain things going for it, but given the state of the world, not quite as much in relative terms as I believe many people believe. And so I think we're going to see the dollar adjust materially lower. Now, what that's interesting in a number of respects because it does, in a certain sense, signal possibly and probably, in my opinion, that the brief correction, I stress brief, although it's been sharp, correction in precious metals prices in dollars has probably also now come to an end. They've held up versus every other currency, versus yen, versus euro, versus sterling, but not versus dollars. I think that's over. I think we're now going to see gold and silver properly get back in gear versus all currencies. And so that would be my long. So stay short the dollar. I think that's the right call. I think the yen led the way and has been telling us that. And I would definitely have precious metals on the other side.
It does feel like we've turned a corner for precious metals at the minute. We did dwell a lot on the dollar and the dollar index. I think it was either last show or the show before. As Andrew says in the chat, it doesn't seem like a week has passed. Perhaps things have been happening. Yeah, time does fly, though I'm not sure I'm having the most fun. I think my long for this week is kind of similar to yours, actually, John. This week, I am long Britannia, or quite specifically the new Britannia design that the Royal Mint has come up with. Let's see if I can get the camera to focus on this properly.
Okay.
It's
Yeah.
they only did this as a proof coin, so they've not done it in full resolution. Well, not as a full mint, so you do have to pay a huge amount more of a spot for it. But I think it's very good indeed. Very cool design, and I think the chap who did it is I think it's Dan Thorne. Is a very young chap, and it's his first Britannia design. So congratulations to the Royal Mint on that. And of course, I think there'll be a lot of demand for silver Britannias in the future. I think my short for this week, however, is the Bank of England, and they do say that you should never fight the Fed, or you shouldn't go toe to toe with the person with a printing press in the market. However, if George Soros got away with it once, I'm sure there's got to be another lucky opening there. I could just go for Andrew Bailey himself, the governor of the Bank of England. There is a headline I'd like to show here, which I think was it was quite extraordinary. This statement, "We are helpless in the face of inflation," claims the Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey. That's from the Telegraph this week. I don't even know where to start with this, John. In what scenario are central bankers meant to say this? Even if it's true, they're never meant to admit that. That's not their job. It's all about instilling confidence. And yet here we are saying that we are helpless and making excuses. What is going on?
Well, I mean, first of all, it doesn't come across very well. I mean,
No,
Andrew Bailey has not been at the Bank of England for a particularly long period of time, but he already has a track record of saying things that are somewhat awkward and rub people the wrong way. And now, arguably, he's completely undermining the actual legal, constitutional, if you will, mandate that the Bank of England has, which is to achieve a price target. Now, let me get this straight. An institution that is mandated to do one thing, primarily, one thing that says it's helpless to do that one thing, has no reason to exist.
no,
And this is the governor saying this. I think he needs a better PR team because you could have at least tried to spin this somewhat better than that. But as someone who's worked in government service and regulation work his entire life, I'm not sure he has much experience in PR. But
perhaps not.
anyway, by the way, did you see the story though that at least retired Bank of England staff aren't too concerned whether the Bank of England is helpless or not, because they're one of the few pensions in the country whose pensions are linked to the old RPI index, which consistently runs higher to the current CPI index and is more than twice as high currently as the cap on many pensions in this country, which I think is around 5. So, they're all sitting pretty because their cost of living and retirement will be covered, even if the institution they work for is getting it wrong. Talk about control fraud, talk about conflict of interest. And Andrew Bailey, in my opinion, is not going to last very long in his job if he does not improve his public image and public statements to more reflect reality somewhat, but we'll see.
Certainly. I mean, as you say, it's not the first time he said something that was odd or undermined the institution which he represents. But this was just quite, I was genuinely surprised to hear someone say that. Why would you say that when your job, you're effectively admitting that you're not very good at your job by
Yes,
trying to deflect the
yes.
blame and just say this is all supply chain stuff which we can't help you with. It feels like they're preparing to make an excuse for not raising interest rates. If I'm trying to think of why you would try and say that, but even then, it seems like a very poor strategy. My thought has always been that central banks, when inflation does arrive, will make only token attempts to raise interest rates and allow the inflation to run pretty hot, so it gets rid of all the debt everyone's been worried about. And perhaps this is part of that. Do you think that is what he was attempting to do and just did it really badly with terrible optics?
Again, I think it's a pure PR exercise. He's certainly attempting to do something along the lines you described. There's almost zero policy implication. This is just cover your what sort of rhetoric. It makes no sense. I suspect there are plenty of central bankers in the world who are, don't get me wrong, each in their own way, not necessarily the most trustworthy and reliable people. But when they see, the emperor having no clothes, right? Andrew Bailey is like walking on the burlesque stage doing a striptease, making them all look even worse than they otherwise would, because who on earth wants Andrew Bailey to do a striptease? But in any event, I mean, that's the thing, right? That they're almost admitting just how incompetent this whole edifice of misguided policy is. And so in a certain respect, it's almost refreshing. Fine, admit it. Admit it that your institution is not fit for purpose. And gee, maybe we should reform how we undertake monetary, financial, and banking policy in this country and other countries.
Yeah.
If you're going to admit it's not working, let's get to work fixing it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Yeah, it's if you do think the Bank of England is helpless in the face of inflation, well, maybe it shouldn't be the Bank of England's job to regulate it.
There you
Very
go.
interesting, John, regarding the Bank of England's pension scheme. It's not the first time that the pension scheme has received a bit of flack in the past. I remember the BOE pension fund itself. They were very heavily heavily in bonds prior to the financial crisis, or they were making the switch, I think, from 2006 to become very, very large holders of inflation-linked gilts. And then, of course, when the Bank of England ends up doing quantitative easing, they end up buying huge amounts of these gilts and pushing the price up an awful lot. And so, I think for the year of the financial crisis itself, you're looking at 2008. I think the Bank of England pension fund was up 11%, while everyone else was getting crucified. And you do wonder what the conflicts of interest might be. But then, when it comes just to the pension promise itself, where you've got a pension linked to RPI rather than CPI. Uh, I mean, even if you're looking at CPI, CPI is running pretty hot at the minute, and CPI doesn't include house price increases. And I think it was this week we've got a 9% print here in the UK for CPI, or at least for some of the metrics for it. And this is the highest it's been in what 40 odd years. Well, any thoughts on that, John? Because I was thinking, if we are talking about Bank of England incompetence and we are talking about very high inflation, and when it comes to blaming other factors, regardless of whether or not they are the true factors behind inflation, I was wondering whether or not Her Majesty's government may seek to take away the Bank of England's independence by blaming them for inflation, and then saying that this will solve the problem somehow, to be seen to be doing something. Do you think that the Bank of England might be risking that?
Well, I think in a way, we've already crossed a certain line here. That is, you can only miss your inflation target so many times before it becomes meaningless. So, in a de facto sense, the Bank of England may still be nominally independent, and yet it's not doing what it is tasked with doing, supposedly independently. So, you've already come a long way in that regard. And so, yes, it would be a very small additional step for an aspiring politician to say that if I become prime minister or chancellor or whatever it is, I will reform the bank. I will either just take it under the wing of the government the way it was for an awfully long time, the way things used to be before Blair and Brown decided this independence idea was a good thing and trendy and whatnot, or they will reform the mandate. They'll write a new mandate. And who knows what that mandate might be?
Yeah,
I mean, it
dread
depends
to
on
think.
which way the political winds are blowing. Um, if it's an inflation targeting mandate, well, okay, you could say that literally the staff of the Bank of England, the governing council, the board, if they miss their mandate X months in a row or whatever it is, they're fired. I don't know, or it could be something even stricter than that, which is based on money supply, credit growth, some other metric, which is clearly and directly, without any excuses, under their control. That might be the next step. I don't know. It really depends on the way the political winds are blowing.
I'd be pretty afraid if they took a nominal GDP growth target. Do you think that might be on the cards?
I'm not sure it is now. I think that modern monetary theory, which of course advocates nominal GDP targeting as the best way to run an economy, I think they've kind of had their moment in the sun,
Hmm.
because all the arguments they were making were implicitly, if not always explicitly, predicated on an environment of generally low and stable prices and resource constraints that were predictable and forecastable, such that you wouldn't suddenly get supply shocks out of the blue. We're not in that sort of environment anymore. We're
No.
not in Kansas anymore, to borrow a famous metaphor from the Wizard of Oz. And and I think it would be difficult now to garner the necessary support for an MMT based mandate when some of the key assumptions behind MMT are really, really being questioned now as just not realistic, or for the world that we actually inhabit.
Right. Yeah. Very interesting to see how this might turn out. Bank of England certainly not doing itself any favors if it doesn't want to change. A lot of very interesting comments in the chat this week. I would be interested in everybody's long and short for this week if you do have any. And hello to everybody who has tuned in. It's great to have a lively chat. We have Tom, who is long Avalanche, the cryptocurrency, and short the British weather. It will never last. I don't say that, Tom. We're trying to savor this while we can. And a quite long question on regarding gold and silver from John. So good evening, Boaz and John. Good evening, John. Good to see gold rising, though which miners are most highly geared to the price itself seems volatile with some contrary price movements. Holding Hochschild and Karora with Sandstorm for royalties, watching signs of the gold-silver ratio rising. Yes, Boaz, blue sky and no heart, no sea mist in Aberdeen. Dishes to do and recorded primetime TV to watch. We'll catch up with you in a couple of hours. Well, John, hope you're having a good time and watching this as a recording. But some interesting comments there, John. What's your take on the gold miner environment at the minute? Because the relationship between the metal prices themselves and then how the miners react later is always an interesting dynamic.
Look, I'm talking my book here because one of my biggest positions is precious metals miners. So, full disclosure.
Yeah.
But actually, when I step back and just say, hey, look, let's look totally dispassionately at what's going on here. Gold and silver have not traded well. Again, that's largely been a dollar strength story, and I think that's reversing. So I take some consolidation there. But to add insult to injury, of course, the broader stock market's been coming off. And so, precious metals miners do get caught up in that. However, the same thing happened in the 70s where you did see periods of decoupling. That is, you'd see gold and silver, of course, surging higher from time to time, but the miners not necessarily doing well if you were in an outright bear market, such as 1973, 74 is a good example. But they eventually do decouple. So I suspect, again, I wouldn't draw any exact historical parallel here, but it's something I feel that as an economic and financial historian, I've seen it before. It looks like it's following a similar pattern. I'm comfortable with it. So assuming I'm right that we're on the cusp of a major dollar reversal and that we're eventually going to see a decoupling of the precious metals miners from the stock market generally, I'm perfectly happy to ride it out. I mean, to each their own regarding risk tolerance, exposure, and how to play it. I am also, full disclosure here, I'm exposed more to mature major miners than any exploration assets, which I think, and I've mentioned this several times before on this chat, in a risk-off environment, which I've been expecting, of course, it's just not where you want to be. I mean, someday they're going to shine again, but not in the near term. So I'm going to try to ride this out in the more robust, developed, mature names. And then eventually, by all means, when I think the smoke is clearing, get back into some exploration assets.
Very, what would be very sage advice, I think, would be the term for it. The smaller companies, John, is that for sort of midway through the precious metals bull market, where it's been sort of realized that this is what's going on and this is where the money needs to be?
What happens is this, right? If you're let's say you're some successful geologist, you've had a good career, but you've always worked for someone else, and you think, God damn it, I know how to find a hole in the ground that has some stuff in it, and I also know people who can get it out of the ground, and let's do this for ourselves. Let's go out and let's allocate some capital and see if if we poke a few holes in the ground, we'll probably find at least something, and it's a hell of a lot better than working for this old company that just does what it does. Okay, some of these guys will get lucky, right? Some of them will, and it's hard to know which, when, and where. But as a general rule, when they make the big bucks, they actually don't stick around too long. They discover the resource. They have their proven asset. And maybe they start pulling a little bit of stuff out of the ground of their own accord and selling it onto market. But the vast majority of them just wait to get snapped up by the economies of scale of the established miners. So in a way, it's win-win for everyone. The exploration companies get bought out, and of course that benefits their shareholders, but it's a one-off. You
Yeah.
don't know precisely when it's going to happen. There's a lot of speculation in that. Who's going to get lucky, who's not, when, with what, how, and so on. Whereas the mature miners also benefit because they get this incremental resource that someone else has happened across through their own blood, sweat, and tears. So the safer way to play it is the mature miners. You still get a bit of a kicker from that.
Right.
But yes, in theory, there's nothing wrong with trying to incrementally, step by step, rotate into the exploration assets when you feel the broader stock market damage to industrials generally, be it precious metals miners or anything else, is behind you.
Yeah.
We're not there yet. I don't think we're there yet.
On that note, John, how many of the mature miners run their own frontier exploration activities, and how many of them just buy the small companies that do the dirty work for them?
Well, obviously, there's a bit of a mix in that. But what's interesting about natural resource companies generally, miners, energy firms, all kinds of stuff, there's something about the cost of capital and the nature of the balance sheet. A mature miner with proven resource in the ground that they know is going to be extracted at a predictable rate over a period of 5, 10, 20 years or more, they can leverage up. They can issue debt against that revenue stream, leverage it, and concentrate profits for shareholders and, of course, for the management team, which presumably owns a
Yeah.
meaningful part of the company. Whereas the pure punting aspect, I don't want to downplay it, but let's face it, there's a huge amount of risk involved. The
Yep.
pure punting aspect of the exploration world, you can't get any debt against that at all.
No.
That's going to have to be equity financed. And because it's equity financed, you can't leverage it. The leverage is in the risk itself, the underlying operational risk of the company itself. Are they going to get lucky or are they not going to get lucky? It's a roll of the dice in some cases. Again, not to belittle the skill these geologists have, but even so. And so you really don't want to have the same capital structure financing both activities. So you see the wildcatters in the oil industry to this day, there are lots of small wildcatting firms out there because that's how a lot of the exploration is still done.
Yep.
And a lot of the other marginal and tangential oil firms that do the marginal rig, they get the marginal rig up, the marginal, whatever it is up when oil prices are high, and then they take it right back down again when oil prices are low. That sort of high volatility operational business requires a lot of equity in the capital structure. But if you're a mature miner, why pay that higher cost of equity? Why pay that higher cost of capital? Just clip your coupon with a leveraged higher debt balance sheet. So that's my understanding of why it tends to be done the way it's done. There are exceptions, but that to me is the underlying way to begin to understand why it is the way it is.
I mean, it makes perfect sense. I mean, I don't see why you'd really object to that sort of system being the case unless it's, a national security priority that we need to get loads of exploration done and shove loads of money into the exploration business. But very very interesting, John. We do get a question from Edward J says, "Hello both. Good evening, Edward. Great to have you here." Jay Burgess says, "Stagflation. This means that we are all going to get badly rogered, doesn't it?" Well, Jay, I would say that not all of us, and you want to make sure that it's not you, but stagflation is going to roger an awful lot of people, and we're already into it, aren't we? Stagflation is something we've discussed since the first episode of this show. And generally, when it comes to speaking of whether or not we were on the inflation side or the deflation side, I think myself and John were much more on the inflation and stagflation side of the debate. And it's definitely here now, sadly. And it's definitely not going to be very good for an awful lot of people. But John, what do you make of where we are at the minute with stagflation as it is, where we're not getting a huge amount of growth and we are getting more than enough inflation?
Well, we're well into it now, well into it. And I mean, this really is generational sort of stuff.
Yeah,
A quick word though, before I elaborate on that, about why stagflation is such a hostile environment for an economy. Now, look, a lot of people say, oh, gee, the Great Depression was awful. And it was. but it was not awful if you were a retired person with savings.
No.
And the reason why is because the, at least initially, deflationary aspect of the Great Depression meant that if you were a retired household and you had been prudent savers during your working life, actually, the purchasing power of your savings was solid. It was even growing by doing nothing but sitting at home. And that was the case throughout the first half of the Great Depression, at least in the United States. The situation was different in the United Kingdom, and I'm not going to elaborate on that here. Okay. The second half was different because President Roosevelt devalues the dollar in 1934. And that then turns what was a deflationary depression into a slightly, gently, I stress gently, inflationary one. But stagflation's worse because not only does it affect every household, it also affects those savers who are retired and who no longer have the option of bargaining for wage rises as a result of the inflation rolling through. So rentiers, as John Maynard Keynes called them, cannot hide from stagflation. They can hide from a deflationary depression, but they can't hide from an inflationary one. Stagflation gets everybody. No one escapes it, unless, of course, you are a tax taker, right? Which the government itself is, say. We already spoke about the Bank of England's very generous index-linked pension scheme, right?
Yeah.
So those guys can ride it out. But the vast majority of the economy, whether you're working, retired, old, young, can't. No one can escape. And investing becomes very difficult because your typical stocks, bonds, cash portfolio will not maintain your purchasing power. Stock market multiples will come down even if prices go more or less sideways, which is still my view going forward. Bond prices will get absolutely hammered, so those on fixed incomes get massacred. And of course, cash also erodes in value. Hence why, in a stagflationary environment, you want to have at least, I can't stress this point enough, at least a double-digit percentage of your investable wealth in precious metals linked investments, or even the metal itself, you choose. Double digits. This idea that 3 or 5% diversifies a portfolio, yes and no. In a stagflationary environment, you need a hell of a lot more.
Yeah, certainly not a place to be holding lots and lots of bonds and lots of stocks, and no precious metals is stagflation. I think there was a great chart actually that came out a while back. I don't think I can share it on this one because it was one of these branded investment bank ones, but it was just talking about how looking through the stagflation of the 70s, how few safe havens there were, and it was eventually just coming to the conclusion that the only safe haven really was precious metals, and particularly just gold and silver, really, rather than the industrial ones. And I think we're an awfully long way from the broad investment market coming to that conclusion at all. And that's a good thing for folks who want to be sort of ahead of the curve. And we could, of course, be wrong. Of course, maybe some miraculous growth wave will appear out of nowhere. Maybe there'll suddenly be a massive deflationary shock that will hit the system. But as it is right now, it doesn't feel like gold is a hugely popular investment. I don't think silver is even anywhere close near
No,
as popular as
no.
gold either.
No, and
Um,
silver always gets hammered. Silver always gets hammered in these risk-off environments, at least initially. It's a much thinner market than gold. It doesn't have the same store of value credentials as gold. It hasn't had them for a long time. Nothing against silver, but that's just the way it behaves day to day. Longer term, things could change, and indeed, my own personal view is that if you're a very long-term investor, you should be targeting at least a 60-to-1 ratio of the gold to silver price, which we're well above currently, right? So silver has a lot of room to outperform here, but for that to happen in a risk-off environment, highly unlikely, in my opinion.
yeah. When it is all risk off rather than just inflation, then certainly. Well, I did record a video with our friend and colleague Nikolai Hubble recently, where I I espoused the great values of silver. If anybody is interested in that, it's just in the Southbank YouTube channel that we're streaming this one on. Do get a comment here from Rune, who is he is thinking of countries for the long and short this week. He's long on Portugal, the least affected European country with regards to the Ukraine war, and short on Germany. Very bleak going forward, I think. Well, Rune, I think I would agree with you there, especially regarding Germany. I really don't see a great deal of sort of hope on the horizon for Germany, and it's not a country that I felt had a very bright future regarding its role with very little in terms of defence, and not really spending a huge amount to try and make sure the eurozone project stays afloat. What's your take on that, though, John? Because you know more about Germany than you've forgotten more about Germany than I will ever know.
Well, look, I lived in Germany for years. Okay, I worked for major German banks. I lived in multiple German cities, and I speak fluent German, and I've studied German history. Now, that doesn't make me an expert
Yeah, it
in
does.
some circles, but whatever. I feel like I have a few things to say, and I look at a map. I mean, Germany is in a difficult position, and Germany's been in a difficult position for an awfully long time. And when you have major shifts in the balance of power between Eastern Europe, or call it Russia, if you will, and the rest of the world, I mean, Germany does get caught in the middle. Now, obviously, Germany can outright, be the bad guys. If you want to, if you look at the 20th century, you can say, oh, Jesus, well, they brought it upon themselves. Well, yes and no. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. Not to forgive, any of the horrific things that Germany did do at various times. But certainly today, the situation in a broad historical sense remains the same. The fact that you've got, Russia squaring off against NATO generally, including, of course, the US. Germany is caught in the middle. And Germany's export engine is so dependent on cheap energy that if they don't get it, they're not going to have that strong economy, which means they can't support the EU, which means the euro itself might fail. And everything that Germany's tried to achieve in recent decades by trying to hold the EU together, get the euro launched stable and well managed, which has not been working out very well, and take advantage of what was actually a very, very good working relationship with Russia for a long time. That's all falling apart. I mean, recall former German Chancellor Schroeder, his first job once he retired from politics was to accept a position on the board of Gazprom. So these ties between Germany and Russia have been growing for a long time, and now everything is upended. It's literally there's a word in the German language which Bismarck used to describe the fundamental threat that Germany faced, given its geopolitical position at the center of Europe. Eingekreist, to be encircled, to be eingekreist. It's happened again, only this time it's largely economic in nature, yet there is a military aspect to it. It's the worst of all worlds for Germany. They have a very difficult hand to play. I don't know how they're going to play it. I have to say, the German leadership currently, and this is not meant to be a political comment, this is a new leadership. They've never really established themselves as state people. They don't really have a historical track record of navigating Germany through any major crisis at all. And now they're faced with every conceivable one all at once. Good luck. I feel very sorry for Germany right now, I have to say.
Yeah, well, I feel sorry for your average German citizen at the minute, certainly. But the encirclement described, John. I mean, this is like the German government's fault. I can't feel sympathy for the decision making that's led to this point. You know?
Look, I mean, Germany is, notwithstanding being a very, very wealthy, successful modern country, it is a prisoner of geography. And we normally think of only tiny countries being full on prisoners of geography because they almost aren't sovereign in the sense that if they don't do what their neighbors want, they get invaded and their governments get overthrown. Germany's obviously a lot larger than that, but in a way, given the scale of what has now happened in Europe, both economically with sanctions and, of course, militarily on the ground, with Germany not too far from what is sort of a frontline conflict. Yeah, what do you do? Very tough hand to play. Now, if I were to parachute into the chancellery in Berlin and try to offer advice to these guys, I've mentioned some very controversial things on this program before that I think would at least help Germany to resolve this geopolitical dilemma that
Yep.
that's perennially found itself in for at least 150 years. But I wouldn't be very popular.
No, no. Yeah, I would imagine. I can imagine it. The literally parachuting in, John, maybe rappelling through the windows or something like that. I mean, I doubt the security is that great. And you've your thoughts on Germany becoming a nuclear power would be, I think, maybe not the most well received, but I think they would be appreciated certainly in the fullness of time. Now, on this topic, there is a headline I would like to share because we are speaking about the geopolitics of Europe. This is Turkey's Erdogan looks to block Sweden and Finland's application to NATO. David in the chat asks, how dangerous a world are we creating when NATO seems to be intent on making Putin and Russia angry, and it seems we are encouraging this stupid situation? Very good question, David. And there are lots of different ways I think we could handle this one. John, just to start with, we have briefly mentioned on the show Scandinavian countries, Sweden and Finland looking for NATO membership, and here we have Erdogan sort of standing in the way in order to get a bit of leverage out of the other NATO allies, or soon to be NATO allies, with Sweden. What is your thoughts, first of all, on Sweden and Finland going for this application?
Well, on the one hand, it's understandable that they might consider applying for NATO membership given what's currently going on. In a longer term historical perspective, I would actually say the evidence is the other way around. That is, it's almost a lesson why you don't want to be aligned with either side when things like this happen. You could argue that both Sweden and Finland were net beneficiaries of their neutrality during the 20th century, and that what would have happened to them had they full on taken sides would have been far worse than what actually did. But for whatever reason, they've decided the lessons of the 20th century are different, and they're prepared to take sides now. Now, Turkey, on the other hand, Turkey's been a member of NATO basically from the beginning. And indeed, Turkey was a staging ground for intermediate range ballistic missiles pretty much from the get go,
Yeah.
which, as historians may recall, were famously quietly removed from Turkey following the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
And Turkey's always been, you could say, this is mixing metaphors a bit, the biggest pawn in the chess game between the US/NATO on the one hand and Russia on the other. That is, NATO's always kind of been willing to gamble with Turkey a bit, given that they're so far out on the periphery of NATO. And of course, NATO's core purpose was initially to protect Europe, not Asia,
Yeah.
against invasion from the Soviet Union. So Turkey's always had this odd relationship with NATO, almost from the beginning. And now, of course, because the world is demonstrably becoming more multipolar, if you look at a map, you can see that Turkey's caught right in the middle of the oil-producing regions of the world, Russia, and NATO and the US in the West. And that's also a tough hand to play. Of course, Turkey has its own domestic issues, the fact that it's an Islamic country and so on and so secular Islamic country and so on and so forth. But this is where it gets really complicated because, okay, Sweden and Finland say, against what I would say the historical lessons are, that somehow it's now time to join NATO. Well, Turkey's saying, well, hold on, there are Kurdish organizations in your country that fund the Kurdish militias in the east of our country that are fighting for Kurdish independence, trying to break our country up. We won't tolerate that within a NATO member. So Turkey's basically saying that Finland and Sweden can't join NATO because they're pro-Kurdish. Well, lots of NATO countries are pro-Kurdish in some sense, but they're already members. So Turkey doesn't have the same power to object, but they're making it very clear now. They're unhappy about that. So if there's going to be a deal to be done here to allow Finland and Sweden to get involved in the fight to keep Ukraine the way it is, Turkey expects all of NATO to support its fight to keep Turkey the way it is and to repel any further threats, as they perceive them, from their Kurdish minority. Now, of course, this spills into political issues with respect to Iraq, with respect to Syria, with respect to Armenia. It's a mess. It's a mess. And it just helps to demonstrate that NATO's core mandate, it's almost kind of passé now. The real issues with NATO are no longer this thought idea that all of a sudden there's going to be a bolt out of blue attack from the Soviet Union westwards that will get all the way to the English Channel. No, it's about all these issues on the periphery. And that's a complicating factor for NATO, and one that may not have an easy resolution.
Certainly. It does feel a bit like, just as NATO has been happy to gamble a bit with Turkey, that Turkey is something of a gambler too, just when it comes to their purchase of Russian S-400 anti-aircraft systems, much to the chagrin of America and well, America, UK, pretty much the rest of NATO. But they're completely happy plowing ahead with it. We do have plenty of commentary on this. I would ask, John, just generally, do you think Sweden and Finland will get what they want and get NATO membership?
I think it's possible, but I think Turkey will likely drag it out. And it could be that things in Ukraine finally begin to cool down before that. I certainly hope they do. I certainly hope so. So I honestly don't know. But Turkey's objections are very material. I've just explained why they're so material to Turkey. And keep in mind, Turkey is the second largest military in all of NATO behind the US. And so they do have some cards to play in this, right? And it's arguably, look, don't get me wrong. I mean, nothing against Sweden and Finland, but from a strategic military point of view,
Turkey's more important
in terms of their ability to contribute anything meaningful with respect to Ukraine or the Western European front generally. It's really not worth talking about. Whereas Turkey really does have a lot to offer militarily. Of course, its position on the Black Sea is of immense strategic value. I mean, again, nothing against the Finns. They have an admirably well-developed defensive strategy. Do they have an offensive military capability? No. Sweden. Do they even have much of a defensive military capability? Not really. So there's not a whole lot going there, okay, that would be available to NATO for use elsewhere. So Finland can protect itself. Actually, it's quite well equipped to do that.
Yep.
It can certainly deter aggression itself. But can it really lend assets to NATO that will allow it to fight in Poland, in Ukraine, in Romania? No, not really. So from a pure military point of view, this is almost more political than military, if that makes any sense.
Certainly. And I think that plays into David's question regarding NATO, well, trying to make Putin and Russia angry, and how dangerous this is making the world. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, when you're thinking of it being political, and this is just about making a statement, is this a good strategy?
It depends on what you're trying to achieve. And what concerns me is that I'm not sure NATO knows what it wants to achieve, or at a minimum is not united about knowing what it wants to achieve. And that's a dangerous game to play within an alliance. And there are many historical examples of alliances breaking up when proper hostilities break out.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, right, countries find that they're in a disadvantaged position and things become a lot more difficult. There are many examples of that. I'm concerned that NATO may be taking itself for granted a bit, and not only Turkey, but possibly other countries are not as deeply committed to NATO when push comes to shove, as history would suggest. So that's a very dangerous game to play. And I mean, again, I'm not predicting for a moment that Germany is just going to suddenly say, "Look, guys, we're leaving." That's not what I'm predicting. And yet, today, when you look around you, the conditions for Germany second, guessing or reconsidering its relationship to NATO, they've changed a lot. Those circumstances have changed a lot, and who knows what might happen down the road. But I do believe that NATO is potentially getting involved in a prolonged conflict without having its ducks in a row. Whereas even though Russia might appear to have the weaker position with respect to a full-on NATO-Russia conflict, I don't think that's what Russia plans on doing anyway. I don't think they ever plan on pushing beyond the Dnieper River in Ukraine. I've said that from the beginning. I don't think that's their intention at all. So if this becomes some prolonged low-intensity thing that doesn't really involve military assets moving towards actual NATO members, but simply is bleeding NATO economies dry and raising political disputes around Turkey and God knows what else, actually, that might splinter NATO in the end without a shot being fired outside of Ukraine. I mean,
Certainly, yeah. I do wonder. I do wonder if NATO will evolve its thinking, some of its strategy. It does feel like a very much a first Cold War construct, which maybe isn't just the best suited for the world as it is. But of course, you don't want to dissolve something like that without having a better alternative already in place, and it's very hard to imagine that happening just off the cuff. Do you have plenty of questions in the chat? We shall address a few of these. Liam says, the way Russia is performing, I wouldn't be surprised if they end up firing the things at themselves. Have you seen Hunt for the Red October? I have, Liam, with Sean Conn, I believe, playing a Russian nuclear submarine captain who goes rogue. Not sure how accurate the movie was for reflecting life aboard ship, but it was a winner. Gerard says US-led NATO has a lot to answer for in stoking this conflict. It's very tricky with this because people are so sensitive about it. So you'll be accused of being a Russian shill, or you'll be paid. You're working for the Kremlin if you even imply that perhaps Russia isn't just the evil country that has
Look,
always been evil.
I like to think we're grown-ups in this chat, and when I
Me
make
too.
comments that when I make comments about things that Russia actually does well or things that NATO doesn't do well, I try to balance them out and qualify them. There are plenty of
You
things
do.
the Russian military is crap at there, but there are things that NATO is not great at either. And the thing is that Russia is actually very, very good at basic ground operations near its own borders. It's done that in Georgia. It's done that in Nagorno-Karabakh and Ossetia and all these places, right? It's very good at that. What it's not good at, and it doesn't even have the military to do it, is to project meaningful offensive power over long distances. It just can't do it, and I don't think it will even try to do it. And the whole operation to get close to Kiev, I said from the get-go, I predicted it would happen, and I said this is simply an attempt to pin down a meaningful part of the Ukrainian military on the ground so they cannot deploy to eastern Ukraine, where the main Russia operation is focused in actually occupying and not giving back ground. That's pretty much what's been playing out. And of course, Russia's made mistakes. Of course, there have been things they've done poorly. Absolutely. Ukraine is trained by NATO. They admit it now. they have a lot of NATO weaponry. They admit it now. This stuff was sort of hush hush for a long time, but now they're
Yeah.
bragging about it as if, ha ha, yeah, we didn't tell you then, but we can tell you now. This is why we're actually doing all right, defending parts of our country. But look, the stuff that Russia does well, they are achieving, and they've achieved a lot of it. Um, does that mean they haven't, lost a lot of soldiers and casualties and whatnot and whatever? Of course they have, but so has Ukraine. But this is what Russia can do. What Russia cannot do is go a hell of a lot farther. So look, anyway, I like to think that we can have these sorts of conversations here and not have people thinking, "Gee, John's pro-Russian." No, I'm not. I'm just pointing out, that there are some things that Russia can do and has done, and let's just acknowledge that and move on.
Yeah, John is a realist for
Yeah.
everybody watching the show. Though I'm sure people were just taking sound bites. I'm sure they could do some massive hit job on us and get us banned from YouTube or something. Uh, but yeah, I think John, you've always got a very balanced take, and given how incredibly biased we're seeing a lot of our own press be regarding this conflict, it does feel like there's an awful need for balance here, which we're not really getting from anyone close to home. Just looking at I mean, it's almost like we're using all of these. So at the beginning, we were laughing at Russia, calling it a special military operation, this land-based invasion. And now here it feels like we're duplicating that with this evacuation of the Azov battalion from Mariupol, and we're calling it like a special evacuation or something. Like this is a straight up retreat surrender operation. Like we're giving it this marketing like this is some really brave, valiant thing that where we're not losing any face. Like this is it's ridiculous. It's farcical in my view. Uh, but yeah, a very
Militarily, understand how important this is also. And you might say, well, gee, why did Russia allow itself to get so bogged down in Mariupol? Well, guess what? It's the biggest port on the Sea of Azov. And so, if you want to be able to supply southeastern Ukraine by sea, you need to take it. But once you have taken it and you can supply southern Ukraine by sea, then you're not entirely dependent on your land-based supply lines. And because the Russian Navy effectively controls the Sea of Azov, it incredibly increases their ability to logistically support further operations now. It's a big deal. You have to look at a map to understand these things. So it might have taken Russia weeks to do it, but they've done it. And now the flow of fuel, weapons, soldiers, whatever else is needed into southern Ukraine is going to double or treble. That's a big deal. So it's a staging ground for further operations. Again, there are some things Russia can do, and they are doing them with some success, and of course the occasional setback. I think Mariupol was probably more difficult than they thought it would be, but it was a critical objective, and they've achieved it.
yeah. It is interesting seeing how a lot of how what the damage control is for folks effectively seeing a defeat on the part of the Ukrainians and how they're trying to deal with it. And yeah, it's not a happy situation, certainly. Edward says, if I wanted to prevent nuclear war, I wouldn't start from here. Me neither, Edward. Me neither. Oh, and indeed, from Andrew, our who was our Cold War submariner in the chat, says the book, which I believe a reference to the Hunt for the Red October, was most believable with regard to life aboard below. Oh well, in that case, may I'll give that one a read, Andrew. Thank you. We do have a question here from. Well, all right. Well, this is another one on the Russian war. Maybe we'll get past that as we only have a few minutes left. But I think we do have plenty of other questions. When it comes to, Gerard says Merkel's legacy will be judged a lot less favorably by history than it is today. I think I would certainly agree with that. I think it already is being judged very harshly already. John, what would you say?
Well, look, she was in power for an awfully long time. Germany did go from strength to strength while she was chancellor. I think there are some things she can rightly claim credit for. And also keep in mind what a historical figure she is, right? To be an East German woman serving as the chancellor of a unified Germany for a sustained period of time. I think in a way you could say it kind of cemented modern Germany as a post-Cold War entity, one that was beyond East and West. So in a way, it's a starting point, but it's certainly not a finishing point. And that's the problem. If Germany is going to mature into a truly post World War II, post Cold War, unified, proud, modern entity, able to take care of itself and continue working its economic miracles, which of course benefit the entire world, not only itself, it needs to be able to operate somewhat more independently. And I think that Merkel never solved that problem. She never laid the infrastructure to allow Germany a bit more latitude in how it chooses to conduct its affairs. She anchored it into the EU, perhaps more than it should be. She anchored it into NATO, perhaps more than it should be. And I know, believe me, again, having lived in Germany for 5 years, still having many, many German friends to this day, a lot of them wish that Germany had the same underlying political skepticism of the EU and was more aggressive vis-a-vis Brussels, Paris, Rome, wherever, and more selfishly, in a good way, represented Germany's national interest. Many Germans feel that way, and Merkel never really allowed the German government to behave like that. Scholz so far is turning out to appear to be not a particularly strong leader either. Early days, but Germany needs someone at some point, someday, who's really going to go to bat for them and say, "Hey, look, we are a great country. Fine, we have a spotty past. What country doesn't? We need to start taking care of ourselves a little bit more and taking care of the rest of the world a little bit less, and let's get on with it." I'm not sure Scholz is that guy.
Yeah, wait and see, I suppose. Maybe he'll pull something out of the hat. Maybe the crisis will forge a strong new leader. Elizabeth says, if you haven't read Nick Hubble's book, How the Euro Dies, get a copy and read it. It's a compelling
Very
read how
good.
Germany could be next to leave the EU. Yeah, we second that, Elizabeth. I remember when Nick wrote that one back, it feels like ages ago now. It feels like, a generation back in 2018. But yeah, those target two balances, Elizabeth, they're gonna kill the euro eventually. Jason asks, does there come a point where gold mining gets banned for the climate argument? I think the gold miners are already ahead of the curve on this. You're already seeing all the major ones say that they're all ESG and they've all made a commitment to saving the climate, which feels like preemptive damage control for the argument that gold mining is terrible for the climate. What would you say, John?
Look, in the same way mining in general it's a dirty industry. There's only so much you can do. If you're going to get stuff out of the ground, you need to use a lot of energy. And when you get stuff out of the ground, you pull out a lot of toxic crap at the same time. You're pulling out, the pearls, the jewels that you want. And the same's true of lithium. The same's true of cobalt. The fact is, every metal that is supposedly essential for green and renewable energy is a real mess to get out of the ground. Gold is no worse, right? I mean, it's no worse. They're kind of all in it together. And so the idea that gold or silver, for that matter, can be singled out as somehow worse than a lot of this
Yeah,
other stuff it's not true. That said, hey, we live in an age of virtue signaling, image is everything. And so it is important for the precious metals industry to look after itself in that regard. But the idea that somehow they should be singled out vis-a-vis mining activities generally is just absurd. And,
yeah.
and I don't think that's a sustainable narrative going forward.
Yeah, I think they'll be. I think the gold miners will survive, though. You never know. Maybe some countries will be more restrictive when it comes to mining licenses within their borders, but it's only to their own detriment ultimately in the end. Apple says, "Good evening, Boaz and John. Good evening, Apple. Great to see you here again. I'm seeing restaurants and cafes open and doing well in good weather, but a lot of small shops closing. I suppose people are. I suppose people are enjoying themselves while they can." Well, yes, I would agree with that thesis generally. John, just in general, when it comes to a stagflationary environment, I've never really looked into it in huge detail when it comes to small businesses and large businesses. But I would assume that the small businesses generally do very much worse than larger businesses do in a stagflationary environment. But does that really just depend on the industries?
Look, other factors equal, when times get tough, economies of scale do help to protect you. They help you in a pure economic sense, and they also help in the sense that they normally grant you more political access. And in a stagflationary environment, political access can be very, very important. So yes. However, that said, a small business that doesn't have a whole lot of debt is in a position to ride things out. A small business that is in a stable margin industry, whatever that might be, will have pricing power even as a small business. So, and they'll be able to, don't get me wrong, they'll still receive price increases from their suppliers because they're just a small business. So they get squeezed on the supply side. But if they've got stable margins on their demand side, they can pass that on to their consumers. So yeah, other factors equal. You are correct. That's absolutely true. But it really depends on the small business in question. And those that are conservatively run and managed, hopefully, will be able to navigate this to the other side.
Yeah, I certainly hope so too. It does, there are tough times ahead, and for small business owners, it's going to be tricky. Gerald asked, does MMT work as long as the economy is healthy and it can successfully and continually absorb the money debt being created? We don't have time to answer this question in full, Gerard, but John did go into detail with this 2 episodes ago. So in episode 42, I believe. So I would just refer to that one. And I think we'll end it with Jason's short for this week, which is short Burnley and Leeds relegation. I think we'll leave it there with with a bit of football banter. But John, thank you so much for joining me again. This has been a great chat, and yeah, hopefully we'll see you back here again next week, perhaps.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Good stuff. Thanks to everybody who has tuned in this evening. Sorry if we haven't answered all your questions. It has been a great chat as ever. Hope you'll join us again next week. We should be going on same time as ever. That's all from us for the moment. Hope you have a very nice evening and a great weekend, and you'll see you in the next one.